Plot and structure are particularly important parts of any fictional story. When we look at plot and structure, we consider several components: the protagonist, the main character or characters, the antagonist, anything or person that is in opposition to the protagonist, the conflict, that opposition, the plot, whether there is suspense or mystery, whether things are expected, as in a formula plot, or something unexpected, the role of coincidence and chance, and certainly the role of surprise. E.M. Forster, a novelist, published a book called Aspects of the Novel, and in it he addressed plot. It's one of the clearest explanations that I have found, and so I'll share it with you. First of all, he defines story as a narrative of events in time sequence, a chronological arrangement of the sequence of events in a story. He says that plot is also a narrative of events, but that the emphasis is on why, causality. The king died and then the queen died is a story, a narrative of events and time sequence. The king died and then the queen died of grief is a plot, because the causality is the most important part, why the queen died. He gives us another example. The queen died, no one knew why until it was discovered that it was through grief. This is a plot with mystery, so you can have a different kind of development. And it suspends the time sequence because we learn about something that happened in the past, why she died, at some point in time in the future. When we look at a story, we say what happens next and then. When we look at a plot, we consider why something happened. And that's the fundamental difference between the storyline and the plot, whether it's in a short story or in a novel. Forster says a plot cannot be told to a gaping audience of cavemen, to a tyrannical sultan, or to the movie public, because they want that suspense, what happens next. They can only supply curiosity. He suggests that plot means that we have to use our intelligence and our memory. We have to think about what happened first, second, and also look at the relationships between the ideas. Suspense, as Forster mentions, is what happens next. Mystery is when something is unknown. In commercial fiction, there's typically a formula. We want to know what happened next. We have the conflict resolved fairly easily and clearly. So when we look at literary fiction, we want to consider coincidence and chance and surprise as a part of the overall story. Is the coincidence or chance introduced as something that begins the story, or is it used as the God from the machine to resolve it? A literary story that is well crafted is not going to use coincidence and chance to resolve the story. There may be surprise, though, and in the event that there is surprise in a well crafted story, that surprise follows logically. And when we look back at the story again, we see the logic of the sequence of events and how one thing resulted in another. Again, Forster's definition, the causality. We also need to consider, partly with the element of surprise, how we end our story. We call it a happy ending, but that means it's satisfactory. And remember, we're resolving the conflict for the protagonist. So it is a satisfactory resolution for the protagonist. Is it unsatisfactory? Or is it indeterminate? That doesn't mean that the story doesn't have an ending to it, but it means that we have to consider what will happen in the future. It's important to look at stories this way because all of our conflicts do not resolve satisfactorily. The reality of life is that we often have unsatisfactory and indeterminate endings for stories and for events. When we look at the protagonist, we look at the protagonist as a main character. There may be more than one. And the antagonist as anything that is opposed to the protagonist. That may involve a conflict between actions, ideas, desires, or wills. Notice that when we talk about conflict, it may be either physical or mental. And generally we categorize conflict as being person against person, person against environment, whether that is nature or society or societal norms, cultural norms, or the conflict can be an internal one, the person with himself or herself. It can be an intellectual conflict, ideas. It can be an emotional conflict, a decision that is based on feelings, or a conflict that's based on feelings, or it may be moral, a sense of right and wrong. When we look at plot, we look at all of these elements. We look at the structure of the story itself, how it is ordered, who it's about, what their conflict is, how the story is constructed, and the elements that the author includes. What your text notes is that if all of these things fit together well, if we can't take any one part out without affecting the whole, then there is artistic unity. And it is that is the goal of good literary fiction. Artistic unity that includes a protagonist that is believable, a conflict that we have interest in, a plot that involves coincidence and surprise in an appropriate way, and an ending that allows us to think about what has taken place.